Hello BookTube, Books with Banks back again with another video today. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite media tie-in book franchises, and it really started off with a video game series. My mom, probably smartly, told my brother and I we weren't allowed to play because we weren't old enough when the first couple games were coming out. But what we could do was we could get into the books. She would let us do that. And so by the time that she did let us play the games finally, around the time the hype train for the third game was coming out, my brother and I, we both had a little bit of the lore background. We had both read some of these books, and that series is, of course, none other than Halo. So I've always really enjoyed and admired the story and the lore here in the Halo universe. I feel like for a shooter, for a sci-fi action thing about a super soldier fighting some aliens, the lore and everything and all of the design of everything, it's all a lot deeper and more. It's more fascinating than it really necessarily needs to be, than especially more detailed and richer than someone who might go on and just play a quick multiplayer game might care to look into. But really, once you start looking, it gets crazy, and especially since the people creating the games, since that shifted from Bungie over to 343, 343 has put out so many books expanding the lore and expanding the universe in the last 10 years or so. But we'll start with some of those Bungie books first, and these were the first three published, kind of all around the time that the first game came out, which is fitting because they all kind of take place around the first game. First here we have Fall of Reach. This is a book that's basically about the main character of the games, Master Chief, but it's about him going to military school. It's about how he was abducted as a child and sort of illegally force recruited as a child along with other children. And it talks about their school, their training process, and it kind of has these big jumps in time, so it's almost like a bunch of short stories going through the main character, Master Chief's history, through the decades leading up to this big battle for the planet of Reach, which they have a video game that shows off, the video game Halo Reach shows off a lot of what's going on in that battle, but that game carefully kind of avoids what Master Chief and his particular squad are doing at the time, because that's definitely the climax here. All of this book leads up right up to the first video game, so that's just Halo Combat Evolved, and in that game you're basically, if you haven't played the series, or if you need a little bit of a refresher, you play as this guy on the cover, Master Chief, super soldier, who he and his artificial intelligence Cortana, who you also get introduced to in this book, he and his AI, they and the crew of the ship that they're aboard, Pillar of Autumn, they crash land on a giant ring world that's called the Halo, and then they and the covenant of alien factions and alien races that the humans have been warring against, Chief and the Covenant are all kind of competing to figure out the secrets of this giant Halo ring. That's the premise of the first game. This gives you tons and tons of backstory, all building up to those events. And I think it's a really, really great starting point, not just because it was the first one published, but Eric Nyland has written a couple more books in the series. So yeah, I really recommend this as a starting point. But then let's move to the second book. All of those plot details I just described about the first game, Halo Combat Evolved, that's all pretty much in here. This is sort of the novelization of Halo Combat Evolved, at least as far as Master Chief and Cortana are concerned. And so I can understand why some people might rank this a little lower, or it might not be their favorites, because I will agree that at least when you're with Chief and Cortana, sometimes you get that feeling of, this is fine, but if I really want all of this action, why don't I just go play the video game again myself, right? But what this book does, and what William C. Dietz, notice this is a different author than the first book and different than the third one we're about to talk about. What Dietz does, I think, so well here is he shows the conflict at the heart of that first game, not just from Chief's point of view that we all get when we play the game, but also from some of the Covenant characters' point of view, some of the like specialized soldiers, the ODSTs, some of their point of view, some of the Marines, and he just does it, I think, in a really brilliant way. Also, the entity that is the Flood, what the Flood are, is one of my favorite things about Halo lore, and just the way that the Halo world building works. In this book, you get a much grosser, much grittier, interesting sort of sci-fi look at what the Flood actually does to the human mind when it attacks us. And that's something that, like, if you're playing the games, you might just freak out when you see the Flood out of the corner of your eye, turn and shoot it. In this book, you might actually have to sit in a character's head as the Flood is sort of taking over their central nervous system, breaking bones. It's very painful, but very, very well written, well done. So I like this book quite a lot. I don't dislike it as much as I think some other people do, although for some of the reasons I mentioned, I could understand why this might not be their favorite. And then at the end of this original trilogy, we have Eric Nyland returning, who wrote Fall of Reach here. He returns to write First Strike, and this is kind of the bridging book between Halo 1 Combat Evolved and Halo 2. So for people that played those games and wonder, okay, how did Chief and some of these other characters get from the ring, the setting of the first game, back to Earth, where they are at the beginning of the second game? This book has all those answers. It's kind of a lot of action, a little bit of plot armor, getting people where they need to be. It doesn't feel like the most patient or the most well thought out, or at least it doesn't feel as well thought out as these first two. To me, it doesn't feel that way. And it kind of has just a ton of work to do. It does all of that work. It connects the two games, but it also brings us back to this setting that we left at the beginning of book 1 to go on our first video game adventure. This book brings us back to characters unique to Fall of Reach and brings them kind of back into the fold of this expanded universe. So sure, even though a lot of the people Chief was training with and a lot of the characters we knew from this planet and from his sort of growing up story, his journey, even though they don't make many appearances or any appearances in the games, this book really does help, First Strike really does help to position them and set things up so that, yeah, sure, Chief and Cortana and all of these other main characters might be going off and having the video game adventures, but we also see why and where some of the other just like book exclusive characters get to by the end of this. So that's kind of the first trilogy: Fall of Reach, The Flood, and First Strike. So next we're going to talk about this group of 5 books, volumes. You'll see what I mean in a second. So those first 3, those are published when Bungie's at the helm. These are all published at that same point in time as well. So first, we have Ghost of Onyx. Eric Nyland returns again. He was clearly the fan favorite of the 2 authors that have written so far. And he takes the story in a direction that is so is pretty disconnected from what's happening in this plot lines of the video games Halo 2 and Halo 4, and really branching out, kind of telling this original story that builds the lore of the universe in its own right. It was very, very exciting, and it wasn't just like, oh, he's dabbling in this other mysterious location and everything established, or all the lore that he talks about here, it's not going to be as important because it's a book and not a game. No, everything Eric Nyland introduces us to here. The Spartan 3s, where as Master Chief was a Spartan 2, the Spartan 3s are introduced here, and the planet of Onyx, what type of planet it is. It's all really, really great stuff. Also, some of the best character work, especially, I think, the best character work Eric Nyland has done with the main character, Kurt. One of the main characters, Kurt, in here. Really, really great stuff. It's a lot of people's favorite Halo novel, and I totally understand why. It's fantastic. The Ghost of Onyx. Next, this could take the cake for my favorite. I don't know, it's probably between this and another one. This, Contact Harvest. Harvest is the planet that the Covenant first encountered the humans, and this is a totally kind of Spartan, or there aren't Spartans in this book really, and this is the first time that's happened. I mean, there's maybe reference to them, but this is really just about the human struggle against the Covenant. This also has one of the most amazing side storylines of Covenant characters between an Ungoi and a Huragok, which are in the kind of more common language of, you know, people who play the games or just people in the world. Ungoi are grunts and Huragok are engineers. Really cool stuff with the brutes in here, because we hadn't seen a ton of brute content or brute references really at all to brutes in the other books. So yeah, this is one of my favorite books. Johnson is a little bit of a laughable, like overly dramatic, like but still fun and lovable character in the video games. Here you really get kind of the genuine heart of him. Really genuine character growth for someone who's just kind of a fun side character in the games. Cool backstory here. And yeah, so this was written by Joseph Staten. And this is kind of like where Bungie was really starting to say, okay, we want just whoever wants to write a story in this world, so long as it doesn't contradict our lore, or if it doesn't contradict it too much, write a story. We don't need to keep things tight as closely to the games. Ghost of Onyx did really well. Contact Harvest by Joseph Staten. This is doing really well. The only thing I'll say that holds this back is there is a sort of weird, like, there's a sex scene near the end, and it's kind of like a here's your reward for saving the day sex scene, and I've never been the biggest fan of that trope. That's one of the, honestly, like, it's such a small scene, and it might not bother other people as much as it bothers me, but that's one of the only things that holds this maybe back for my top spot of my favorite Halo books, at least of the ones I've read so far. Next, we have Cold Protocol. This is another fun romp with Spartans. Romp is maybe too light of a word, but really, it's this other team of Spartan 2s, kind of the espionage, Secret Service type version of the super soldiers, of the Spartans, and they're involved in this really complicated trade political relationship with these jackals and these grunts, and what they're mining, and a certain disk with information that gives coordinates to key planets in the human, all the human colonies, especially Earth. The Cold Protocol is basically this idea in Halo where if a ship or anything is abducted or kidnapped, or if being attacked or in threat in any kind of way, in that ship, or that ship has to basically purge all records of where Earth is and where the locations of not only Earth but a lot of the important military planets and military bases are for the human army. For the UNSC is the human side of the forces. So it's an interesting concept, and really it's kind of like the fact that there's an artifact or an object that has this data on it. It's kind of just a MacGuffin that everyone's like fighting over for this whole book. It's pretty chaotic. A lot going on, like really short chapters, like if that helps give a sense of the pace here. It's a lot of fun, not the most like heart-wrenching or heartwarming, or not the most pathos, I guess, here. Not as much as Contact Harvest or Ghost of Onyx, but still a ton of fun. I think it's one of the shortest ones too. So that's Cold Protocol, and that was the 6th book they published. Then they published the Evolutions collection of short stories, and some of these were written by some of the authors we've covered so far. I might do a video if people are interested in this type of media or Halo media tie-in content. I might do a video just breaking down the different stories in here, but there are some wonderful stories here. I mean, just like even the more boring bad ones, the ones that are good are so good that I think anyone who's a fan of the games should at least pick up this Evolutions collection. Just just the Mona Lisa is an amazing story. Everything I love about the Flood is encapsulated so perfectly in some of the stories in here. You get a really interesting story about the drone alien race, which is really kind of ignored a lot of the times, I feel like, in the games and the books. But wonderful, wonderful stories here. Highly recommend anyone read this if you're not going to start with Fall of Reach or Contact Harvest, as those are the introduction to Master Chief or the introduction to the Human Covenant War. Start here because a lot of the stories are pretty short, real quick reads, really great stuff, and you'll be introduced to authors. Some authors here have written other novels in the Halo universe, so really I think you would do well to start here if you don't want to start in either of those other two places with either Nyland or Stanton evolutions. Fantastic, fantastic collection. So these, let's see, so my evolutions is 2 volumes. I'll count it as 1 basically. These 7 books here are, if we're counting evolutions as 1, these are pretty much the novels. There's some graphic novels, but I don't have those, and I'm not going to go into those in this video. These are the ones that were published under the banner of Bungie, when Bungie was running things. And then, after Halo 3, after Halo ODST, after Halo Wars and Halo Reach, Bungie had pretty much finished up all their games, and they handed over the reins to 343 Industries. I'm going to put these Bungie books to the side and introduce the 2 trilogies that 343 Industries really kicked off all of this explosion of additional media content with. So first, I'll introduce this trilogy I like a little bit less, even though I like both of them. But this is the Kilo 5 trilogy, starting with Glasslands, then the Thursday War, and then Mortal Dictata. So this is a trilogy that's really concerned with what happened after the Human Covenant War ended, and what kinds of difficult political conflicts are going on internally with the human side of things and the Covenant side of things. There's a lot of religious zeal on the Covenant side of things where people hate that peace was ever agreed to with the humans and don't want there to be peace. In a way, there are human factions, and especially like Oni, CIA type operatives who think it's in their best interest to keep the Covenant divided and to keep them kind of at war in amongst themselves and with each other. So they get up to some really dirty, horrible tricks, supplying the Covenant with weapons, feeding them lies, feeding them misinformation, or information that, they just illegally obtained, through illegal surveillance methods, to keep their once enemies, the Covenant, fractured, and to keep them at war and to keep them fighting each other. So this series, albeit a bit long-winded at times, especially I think this first book, Glasslands, the main focus I think is really on dealing with characters who are grappling with the ethics and the morality of these questions of should we be really instigating this Civil War type of stuff. So it asks a lot of really, really deep questions. Some of the characters that Karen Travis is the author, she does a great job. I think her style is fantastic. Her prose flows very, very nicely. Some of the characters, it's pretty clear that she favors some more than others, which I don't blame her. What author loves all of their characters equally? But sometimes it's like one argument that a character will hoist against another, and really hate them. It sort of feels like Karen Travis really wants us to hate certain characters, but then the same argument could just as easily be made for this one character who's like, no, but she was in the right because she was a hardened soldier, or whereas the other one was just a meddling doctor. Sometimes it's difficult to analyze the theme here because it's difficult to figure out what Travis was trying to do with some of these characters, especially when in Glasslands they kind of just sit around a lot of the time. Thursday War has a lot more action. Mortal Dictata really has a lot more heart. There's this brilliant stuff with child abduction, trauma, who's a terrorist versus who's a freedom fighter. That's brilliant stuff in here. Mortal Dictata is easily my favorite of these 3 books. This Kilo 5 Karen Travis trilogy. It's really good stuff, especially if you want to fill in some of the gaps between Halo 3 and Halo 4, in that kind of interim where the reins of the games are being handed over. So yeah, that's Kilo 5 trilogy. Next, we have probably my favorite set of books, and that's because I love lore, I love deep dives, I love the Flood, and this is the Forerunner trilogy by Greg Bear, famous sci-fi author Greg Bear was signed on to write these, and I think he knocked it out of the park. The diction is a little alien and very unusual, and I think that was a very much an intentional choice, especially in this first book, Cryptum, and Silentium, lesser extent than Cryptum, but in the first book, I think he really wanted us to introduce us to how totally alien Forerunner society was. And now we're talking hundreds of thousands of years before Human Covenant War, before any of these other books we've talked about so far. This really just sets up the Forerunner Flood War beautifully. It introduces characters that are going to be important in Halo 4 really well. Granted, what Halo 4, the video game, winds up doing with those characters, it kind of flattens them a little bit and makes them a little less interesting than they are in this trilogy. When I think the purpose of these books was kind of to do the opposite, was to make them more interesting in the game. Really, it just kind of stands out by comparison how much more interesting they are here, and how much more interesting it is getting the lore delivered to us through this story as opposed to the Halo 4 story. I still like a lot of things about Halo 4, but these books, lore-wise, everything they do with the Didact and the Librarian, it's all better in this trilogy. And I'm a sucker for lore. I'm a sucker for prequels. Anyone who's seen my Malazan videos, my Carcanis videos can attest to that. I will say, I mentioned these two and how they're written a little differently. This one it still has a lot of the same prose elements of, those same style elements of the other two, but this middle book really kind of steps to the side and focuses on one character's adventure from the first one, a character named Chakas, and basically what he's doing and a sort of team he has around himself exploring one of the Halo worlds. And the lore building and the lore got me into this universe, and so this book where they're just spending time on one of the most important Halo rings, Halo constructs in the universe, so flood heavy, so, I mean, Primordium is the name of the book, and that is a reference to, what character thing, I guess that's a reference to. It's so fascinating to me. Love these books. If you want lore, and if you're not too afraid of diving in at the deep end, you could start with these, but they're a little denser. They're probably the densest and least action-packed of all of these Halo books. But yeah, so to summarize, here we have, for this kind of middle chapter of the Halo books, we have these two trilogies, the Forerunner trilogy and the Kilo 5 trilogy. I think both trilogies kind of had mixed reception. I think they're both pretty good. I prefer the Forerunner trilogy, though. Alright, so there's that. And then, other than that, I personally have only read two novels. Two other novels. And those are... here we go. Halo Broken Circle by John Shirley. This is a great introduction to some of the history of the Covenant, how they pulled certain races together. You get a lot from the Prophet, or Sanshium is what they call themselves, the Sanshium point of view, which is really cool to me. I thought they were always so cool, because they're not a super militaristic race. but they ally themselves with like the elites and the jackals who are, better, more equipped to fight, to wage war, really. So yeah, a really interesting book. Again, the author there is John Shirley. Really interesting for background on the Covenant, how they came together. Once it catches up with events, like more than the first half is all background history stuff, but then once it catches up with events around kind of contemporary with the end of Halo 2 and Halo 3, then it kind of starts to drag a little in my opinion, but I did really enjoy this kind of offshoot lore dive of a novel. Not as much as some of the other series I've talked about, and I probably wouldn't recommend this as anyone's first starting point unless really the one thing that you're like totally most interested in about Halo is the Covenant itself. And then last and possibly least, Hunters in the Dark is the most recent book that I've read in all of the Halo canon. This is the last one I'm going to talk about today. I might eventually do another video on all of the other 343 era kind of published books that I'm yet to get into. I'm excited to get into those, but first I'll say with this, I hope those aren't too much like this. It's kind of just an offshoot adventure story that doesn't seem to have too many big implications for the Halo world on the whole. I mean, it introduces one character who is important for Halo 5, but Halo 5 is a game with a number of problems, and while it makes that character a little more interesting, this book does, the game, still never really did anything great with her. But they do go, like the setting of this adventure and the action here is pretty interesting, being that it is set on the Ark, which is a setting that I really enjoy from the video games, a setting from specifically Halo 3 and Halo Wars 2. So yeah, that's that, and if you are interested in any more Halo content, me talking about the games, or especially me talking about the books, I do want to keep this channel mostly to books, but I'm happy to do some game content every once in a while. But yeah, if you'd like to hear any more of my thoughts on the books, any of my thoughts as I read more and more into this series, please let me know in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. Thank you so much.